Hello and welcome to a trilogy of very unusual features, because we're going to visit a family that don't own one Marcos Mantula, not two Marcos Mantulas, but three Marcos Mantulas.
Hello, my name's Mark, this is my wife Jan, and together we own three Marcos Mantulas. We've owned the cars, or the first car we bought was in 2004, and that started, well, quite a craze really, and got addictive. So we have our first car, our blue car, that was bought in 2004, and that got us into the Marcos world. That followed with the building, or assembling, shall we say, because the car was not a whole car at the time. We had to really start from scratch with it, and we had a silver car. Then one drunk night from Facebook we started the third project, and that really is where we got totally crazy. So it's been a very enjoyable ride, and we've had a tremendous amount of fun with the cars over the years. The cars have got us to all kinds of events, we've been to all kinds of shows, and it has just been an amazing experience.
Going back to the very beginning, the plan wasn't to get a Marcos at all, was it?
No, I'm a complete petrol head, and the original plan, or the dream, was to build a GT40, form a 40th, and go to the Le Mans Classic. Because when I was 40, it was going to be the 40th celebration of the first win in the race. But that didn't quite work out, but I was totally into the kit car scene, if you like, at the time, and its possibilities. So when that didn't come to fruition, we went and looking online to see what was out there, and we went through, at the time you could get some very cheap Ferraris or Lamborghinis, and obviously for the price that we could afford, the condition would have not been good and it would have been an absolute money pit. But Jan found an LM400 Marcos, and I was like, okay, not quite sure what that was, because I knew the earlier Marcoses, of course, the earlier 3-litre V6 particularly, but hadn't had much to do with them through the 90s. So the journey took us down to a dealer where the LM400 was just going out on a test drive, and we'd missed that one, and we just saw a, well, strange looking little cutie in the corner. Yeah. And that's the blue car here, and that's where we started our journey. So
this car, you found out, has got a bit of history as well, so if you want to explain that.
Well, yes, it had quite a past. The previous owner had taken what was be considered a normal Mantula and rather, well, put it through some pretty aggressive actions, from the full body kits, the splitter, the spoiler, the side skirts. Then he wanted more power. It had a 3.9 or 4 litre Rover V8 in it, and he discovered nitrous oxide. And that was really, well, yes, that was a path that he really got into. And back in 2002, an article was done on the car with the previous owner, entitled "The Gas Man Cometh." On the title page, it was the 390 brake horsepower Marcos Mantula. And when we got the car, that engine had been blown to smithereens. We didn't know anything about its past. We just thought it looked a nice car. So we bought it as it was, basically, if you like. And once we got it home, then we started to find out what its history really was. So
what engine did it have when you bought it? Was it just a stock Rover?
A little bit unsure. It was quite an asthmatic Rover 3.5 V8 in it at the time, on twin SUs. We could see that there was the bracketry and everything for something different for the engine, and there were certain mods done because the battery was put in the boot, which wasn't normal. So something had happened to it, and it had MSD ignition on it at the time, and we later found out that was obviously for getting the ignition timing right and enough power to run the nitrous.
So you've bought the car with an asthmatic Rover V8. What was the plan? Were you going to use it as a track car because of its wild looks, or was it just to run it using the looks as an item of interest, as it were?
Well, when we got the car, we obviously still wanted to go to Le Mans. That was the ultimate aim, to take a car to Le Mans. But basically we wanted the car so that we could just go to car events, show the car, and just get really into a nice hobby vibe environment where we could show the car and see if people were interested in it, really. Little do we expect, really. I mean, we call it Wonder Wander because you can drive down the road in it, and all of a sudden, if you're on a motorway, you can see cars weaving in front of you as they suddenly see a car in their mirrors and think, what's that?
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, it scares you sometimes. You see people straining to see your car and
all over the place.
So, what was next with the car? How did it develop from there?
Well, we started getting to certain events. So went to Silverstone and Donington for races and things like that. And a lot of the club race scene and the classic scene at that point in time was fairly low key still, around 2004, 2005. But it was lovely to go into those races and seeing cars battle it out, if you like, from times gone past. And a lot of people talked to us about the car. We started to learn that the engine had its limits, if you like. It wasn't running particularly well. It was really showing its age and how it had been treated. So I think we decided in about 2007, I think, 2008, we were going to Le Mans. And we just got in touch with the club as well and signed up to the clubs to do all the event organising, to get all the tickets and everything organised. But I thought, I can't go with a 3.5 litre V8. I want something that's going to get us there. We'd signed up for parade laps around Le Mans, and we were going to do this right. So at the last minute, fairly last minute, I decided I'd put a 4.3 litre V8 in it from a classic Range Rover. So we went up to, I think it was South Manchester, yeah, and with an old Range Rover, loaded the engine into the back of the car and brought it back. And then the job of installing. The clutch just about held the power of the 4.3, but once we got back from Le Mans, that had to change because it was just slipping under the amount of torque that engine put out. It was a tremendous engine. We had an amazing time at the Le Mans that first time, and we camped overnight in the car basically because we
slept in the car for 5 nights.
It was, yeah, and slept at the circuit one night as well because it was just so late by the time we finished and watching the racing. It was like, well, let's just sleep here and wake up in the morning and carry on.
The body kit is fantastic for makeup. You can use it like a kind of like your little sort of dressing table for that. It's brilliant.
Well, it's just the right height as well,
Yeah,
I imagine.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the French have an interesting idea to parade laps, and we were somewhere at the back of the group, and we got a good run up the Mulsanne. So 140 miles an hour down the Mulsanne. What an experience. From there on, I think that was it. We were hooked. That was it. We were just hooked on Marcus at that point. It's being able to swap the engine as I did. It just seemed a practical car that I could use, I could maintain, I could do a lot of the work on.
So from there, carry on with this car and take us from there over the years, how it's evolved to where it is now.
Well, the car continued with that V8 in it. It was quite notorious at events because of just how loud it was. I mean, I'm not talking
we couldn't do a lot of track laps simply because we were too loud.
Yeah.
You know, people would...
We tried to get into a 105 decibel limit, and they said, oh, just calm it down a little bit. You don't. Well, even at 2,000 revs, we were still doing 110 decibels, so it just wasn't going to happen. So it was a bit of a pity, really, because we couldn't do some of the playing when we got to some of these classic races to do parade laps and things like that because of the decibel limits. So we continued using the car, and we could see the condition was deteriorating slowly and things like that. So for that car, it carried on being used quite regularly to go to shows and events, and we stopped using it then for events about 2012, 2013. It had an advisory on the chassis. The chassis had a hole in it. Well, as with any old British sports car, you find one, there's more. So we basically, I wouldn't say mothballed it at the time, but in 2008 we'd have started the first real project, and that car I managed to get on the road for 2011. So from 2011, effectively we had another car we could use, and that car I put it together so that my wife could drive it as well. So in theory we could take both cars to events, and we did for certain events. We took some girls to their prom event with a car each.
Yeah.
And basically it was nice to have both cars on the road, but basically the car needed to have some more major repair work done on it at that time. So that really then took the car off the road definitely from 2013, and it stayed off the road. Our third car then got in the way.
But with the blue car, you had already decided what engine you wanted to put in it, and so we also had the complete car, the Toyota Sora, just sort of like at a friend's lockup, basically, just waiting to start that next stage.
Yeah. But these ideas came about really from doing the first project and getting more and more into the Marcos scene and its history, where the chassis could take 4-cylinder inline engines, 6-cylinder inline engines, 2.5 litre and 3 litre, 3 litre V6s. You had obviously the Rover V8 versions, and the Marcos Mantulas were all sold basically to have a Rover V8. So all of these cars would have originally been sold to have a Rover V8 in them. But there was even, I'm led to believe, a V12 model around. So there were some ideas there, and the later cars obviously went on to use bigger V8s with the LM series, using the 6-litre Chevy engine, and also then the Mustang engine, the 4.6 litre, which came naturally aspirated and supercharged from Marcos cars. So with that background, I thought, what would be a nice engine to put in the car? A straight 6, I thought, lovely smooth engine, and it was a case of hunting down that engine at a cost-effective price. And I've always tried to do things within what my capabilities are, and try and do as much as I can to actually move projects forward. Only when I didn't or I couldn't do the work, and let's say spraying to a decent quality, because that's where you really notice the car, if you like, then I handed over to a professional body shop to carry out that work. But I was determined to do as much as possible. So I carried out, well, I think we ought to tell the story really, that having done 2 project cars, I was under threat of death not to start the 3rd car or take it to bits. And well, an opportunity arose when Jan was away with her parents.
My final words to you were, "Don't start the project." And I came back and the car was in pieces on the drive.
The body was off, so we could see all the horror around the chassis.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, it was, but totally fortunate, because it was just before, well, this was 2019. Obviously nobody knew what was coming up, but I just managed to get the chassis repaired and strengthened in time and through. I've got the chassis galvanised, hot dip galvanised, so that takes away all the future worries of rust coming back. And I got the chassis back from Powder Coat then, just in time before everything got completely locked down, so I could just tinker to my heart's content in the garage, building the car back up again.
Right, so you've chosen the Toyota Sora engine. That isn't a 5-minute installation. What is it that you do for a living as well? Because that's relevant as well for the car enthusiast.
Well, I'm a manufacturing engineer, to use my proper title, I suppose. I've worked at Land Rover for some 31 years now. I have done many very interesting projects, from installing production equipment that makes the body shells in the body shop, and very large conveyor infrastructure projects, from designing the concepts, planning, and then project managing right through to installation, commissioning and delivery.
I thought it was important to mention that, because it does sort of show that there is an engineering background that
well, a bit more than that actually, because I actually started at the Cowley Works in 1982 as a craft apprentice, and that obviously that was back. I was starting on the Press Steel Fisher site. I think we were called Austin Rover at the time.
Yep.
And the production lines at the time were doing the Rover V8s there, and obviously there was all the Thunder Sport series going on and a lot of hype around those cars at the time, and I was just a committed petrol head really. My first car, well, I had motorbikes to start with, but my first car, it shames me to say, was a 1300 ITEL. That went within 6 months for an MGB. Yes. Roadster.
And I was the only girl in sixth form with a boyfriend who had a sports car.
Well, that's pretty damn cool, if you ask me.
Things were different back then, weren't they? Cars were cheap. Cars were cheaper, you know, and
yeah.
it was more practical to have that sort of thing as a starting driver or an early driver.
So moving back to this, you've got the Toyota engine. Which gearbox did you go with, and how did you line it all up? And if I remember correctly, was this the first car that you tried the alternative rear axle, or?
No. Okay, here we go. The introduction of the axle, I've used Jaguar axles on these 3 cars. The thought where that came from was really the idea that there was a Jaguar Marcos out there, a V12 Marcos, and obviously if they used the V12 engine, they must have used the back axle for that amount of power and torque. And that really, it was using that axle on my first project, the grey car, that cemented the idea that it was a really good axle to use. And we were lucky to have contacts locally as well, could point us to a company around Evesham that could narrow the axles down. So the silver car had it narrowed to a S-type Jaguar width, and the other 2 cars have been narrowed to E-type widths.
So what was the original axle? Was it an XJ axle? Or?
Right, the original axle with the car would have been a 3-litre Ford Capri.
Yeah.
And that was, well, it's very hard to get decent quality bearings, brakes, oil seals, and the axles are bracketed specifically for a Marcos. They have to have brackets welded on very precisely to make sure you get the axle geometry correct. That seemed, or trying to get that work done, I thought, from the silver car, I thought this is much easier to put a hole Jaguar unit in, it's much easier to align with the whole cage because the whole cage for the axle fits in as well, surprisingly easily. And it was from that first car that the other two cars then got those axles as well. We just happened to, well, as far as the engine goes, it was very much a case of, we had a short spell with a Nissan Skyline, and I just loved that straight six power with a turbo. It was just something else. And it was a case of, to get a Nissan engine at that time, because of course they're in Skylines, you're not going to get one very cheap. So with online sales, you go searching to see what you can get, and picked up on the fact you could get a Toyota Sora for a reasonable price. So it was that idea that got us into it, and that would have been around 2012, 2013 I went looking for that car. It also then was quite reasonable to be able to pick up a Toyota gearbox. And obviously the best gearbox to get was the Supra gearbox. A Mark III had turbo. Supra had an R154 gearbox. It had two gearbox types, I think a W version and then the R154. And I managed to find an R154 gearbox on that well-known online site that happened to have a 1JZ conversion bell housing as a kit. What I thought was quite expensive at the time, but I think over the last, well, yeah, 8 years or so, prices have gone through the roof, and you'd be lucky to find one of those gearboxes.
Very lucky. And we picked everything up at the right time, really. Very lucky.
So that's now running a 3 litre?
A 2.5 litre.
2.5 litre straight six.
Straight six, with twin turbos.
Welcome to part 2 of our Marcos Mantula trilogy. We first covered this car. Now, stay tuned for the story of this car.